Well, hey, folks,
Hey.
if you're still up, hopefully you are. We're going to come at you live. We're going to be talking a little bit about Saints in day one of the draft, but John Hendricks alongside Ross Jackson.
Hello.
We are
Good
real
evening.
people, and we are at the Saints facility and stuff, still putting in some work and all that good things and
Yeah.
all that fun stuff. Ross, first day of the draft, Felicia Fuaga.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the guy that we
thought it was
mocked,
going to
right?
be.
I
Yeah.
mean, you joined us. If you tuned in earlier, this was our guy, right? We
Right.
talked, and then I wrote about the mock draft and had him there. It was between him and J.C. Latham, but obviously Latham went really early.
Yeah.
But you look at this draft and see really how the board, like 6 quarterbacks, and
Man.
especially what Atlanta did. I don't think anybody saw the Michael
No.
Penix stuff coming, but man, the board played into it. And then, of course, we talked about Brock Bowers before, but the Raiders ended up getting him. But the Saints, they made out with the guy that they really, really love.
Yeah, this is huge for them. And being able to do it by standing pat, letting the draft come to them, didn't give up any assets, didn't trade up. They didn't panic. Remember, that was a big thing we talked about, like, don't panic.
Stay put.
Yeah, and Dennis Allen, when we spoke to him after round one of the draft, he spoke a lot about having a handful of players that they felt really good about before the draft. Mickey Loomis, general manager, was talking about, hey, we pick at 14. There's actually 14 players that we really love. And so this was an opportunity here to where you saw position of need and best player available kind of intersect here in order to be able to land Fuaga, which I think is the pick that we were kind of looking at for this team, that made the most sense for this team immediately and in the long term, especially with all of the big question marks hanging around about Ryan Ramczyk. Where are they going to go on the offensive line? This couldn't have gone better for New Orleans. And really, the board going into day 2 looks really good too. We don't have to jump that far in the conversation, but like, it's looking good for them here so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like we kind of know what we're talking about because we've been talking about the Trevor Penning stuff. Like, again, I think the thing, and one of the things Dennis Allen told us was talking about that, look, there was some things about Fuaga that they might move him interior, like some scouts were looking at that. But Allen says, arm length, and you even asked him about that. I want to talk about that in a second, how that's not really a big deal. No. But, they're envision him at both tackle spots, think he could play at both tackle spots. But obviously right tackle is where we project him because Trevor Penning is going to be in that area. And Dennis Allen even, I don't want to say double down, but reinforcing that Trevor Penning is a guy that they still believe in. And that's something we've been talking about for months. But with Fuaga, it's a guy that can come in. Again, the Ryan Ramczyk stuff, it's not set in stone on what actually is going to go on right now with his future, but it's not that promising. And, of course, the Saints maintain that they have time. But Fuaga is a guy, again, he's very nasty in his play. Mm-hmm. He's very, very good when it comes to pass protection. Again, a guy that didn't give up any sacks in his 2 years of starting at Oregon State. So, again, I don't know that there's a thing. It's like it's not overthinking the pick, and they did the right thing. It's a rarity, and we're happy that they didn't trade down or trade up. Or I mean, that was a possibility, but they make out in a good way for the first night.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really also like about Taliesin is that you're in a situation here. Taliesin, excuse me. You're in a real good situation here where you're drafting somebody that's played in a Power 5 conference, that has gone up against elite edge rushers. Fuaga talked to us after being selected about his game against Laiatu Latu and UCLA and how that kind of helped to put his helped to put him on the map a little bit more. And that might have been a situation to where that competition, that head-to-head with what ended up being the first defensive player, not just edge rusher, but first defensive player off the board, like him going head-to-head with that guy and effectively blanking him in that competition level. That's what kind of set him up to be this top 15 selection, or at least started the trajectory and continued the trajectory. Then you add in that health along with just production in the pass protection game of not allowing sacks. He's active and kind of aggressive in the run game, which I think is a part of the attitude that the New Orleans Saints really like. But the thing that I thought, and you had tweeted about it, one of the other things that really stood out apparently was his maturity.
Right? Yeah. That's several times that Dennis Allen talked about him being a culture fit guy, right? Twice he said that, and the maturity. This is the one that they fell in love with the combine, and that's the interview that they had was at the combine. But it was kind of just referencing, just the fact that everybody in the organization saw the film, they saw everything that they really liked about Fuaga, and it wasn't something that they had to guess, right? And so that says about a lot about the prospect, and I think something that DA's talked about, Mickey's talked about, is the culture in this locker room. And they want people that are bought in, and they want people that want to be here. And so Fuaga, they feel like, is going to fit in perfectly for them. And so I don't disagree. I think he's got a great energy to him. The fact that he represents a Polynesian group that is
cool.
so minute. I think there's only 2 players, and he would actually talked about Lofa Tupu as one of the guys that he really looked up to, a Seattle Seahawks linebacker. And so you were mentioning the arms. You asked DA about the arm length because some people are like, oh, these guys might get T-Rex arms. I remember they said that about Trey Hendrickson.
Right.
Look at him.
See how that worked out.
Yeah, right. So talk about a little bit about what he said about that.
Yeah, so typically when it comes to evaluation of NFL draft prospects, 34-inch arms is typically the threshold. The truth of the matter is that every team has a different threshold.
Yeah.
And every team will make exceptions on that threshold based upon whether or not you're reasonably you kind of different from what it is that threshold is. And there are a couple of things that factor in that. But I asked Dennis Allen about it specifically. It was a big time knock on him at some point early on in the draft process. And then I think as people watched the tape, they kind of chilled out on it, stopped talking about it a little bit. But it was one of the reasons why a lot of people kind of talked about the idea of teams might being interested in moving him on the interior, as you mentioned. So I asked Dennis Allen about it. And I like the way that DA explained it was that, look, sometimes you see stuff like that. He did admit that his arm length does come in a little bit less than where their threshold is or where their prototype is. But sometimes you're willing to delineate from the threshold if the player still gets the job done. And one of the things that he mentioned was, like, sometimes you watch it on tape and you see short arm length, but when it comes to Fuanga, you do not notice short arm length being there. And I love your comment too. It's very rare that you ever see a guy get a sack and go, well, man, if his arms were a little bit longer,
it really is.
Like, you never hear that. And so, so the thing that I'll point out is one of the things that factors into your sort of ability to be able to kind of eschew him being a little bit under the prototype in terms of arm length is what's his wingspan. Yeah. He's got broad shoulders. And so he probably makes up for that 7/8 of an inch somewhere within from shoulder to shoulder. And then you don't see it show up on the play tape that way. And I think when you've seen him go up against speed rushers like Laiatu Latu, in that same UCLA game, they had a versatile number 98 that played on the inside and on the outside. Big dude, fared extremely well against him too. Took him off his feet at one point. That's what you saw from Fuanga on tape, not somebody that looks like you go, man, I wish his arms were 7/8 of an inch longer. I just don't see it.
I mean, that's the type of stuff you get in with the draft all the time. You hear about these metrics and all this other stuff. And so, again, he's going to be fine. He's going to be a guy that could really start. And, of course, they get a tackle that they could get a fifth-year option. But this is a guy that could be easily a 5-year starter, 10-year starter if they do things the right way. And so I'm really excited to see him pair up with John Benton. And I think this is a great way for the Saints to start the draft. And now as we turn our attention to day 2, only number 45 to work with. So Dennis Allen kind of put this in perspective, saying that they have the 13th pick. So 12 other teams are going to be picking at it in front of them, and they don't have anything else in round 3. So they could, like, we've looked at the mocks. When we did a trade, we didn't say we traded into the 3rd round, but we did get that extra 2nd round that didn't happen. But we could have been a possibility. But 45, what do they need? Who's some guys that maybe in their cloud that they might look at?
Yeah, there's a couple different positions. Why don't we start at wide receiver, which I think is the one that everybody collectively agrees is like, all right, you need a possession guy. Xavier Legette, unfortunately, going off the board at 32. Dang, the Carolina Panthers trading up one whole pick to keep Buffalo effectively from grabbing it, right? Buffalo traded away Stephon Diggs. Clearly, there was a need there at wide receiver. And so Xavier Legette going to Carolina, that stinks. On a couple of different levels. But I will say, like, there's still some really good wide receivers out there. Keon Coleman out of Florida State, of course, is one of the media favorites. And is a guy that we've mocked to the team before. Big guy, enormous catch radius, can kind of erase a little bit of inaccuracy if you ever see it. He's one of those guys that can be reliable. I know everybody wants to make a big deal out of, what was it, a 4.61 40 or something like that?
I mean, that's all I hear about is the knock on his speed. And so, and Mike Thomas wasn't the fastest guy in the world either. I'm just saying.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so interesting is, I know this is a very common talking point, so forgive me for recycling something here, but you saw the 4.61 40 that was below what you would expect from a wide receiver, but then he was the slowest wide receiver in the 40, but he was the fastest wide receiver in the gauntlet when he was actually running on a football field. Imagine that. Sometimes guys play faster than they run in a straight line in underwear. Like, who'd have thunk? And so I think that, like, Keon Coleman is probably like a good target at 45. And if he ends up being there at 45, we're talking about a fantastic draft for the New Orleans Saints if they come around with those two guys. There's others. Jalen Polk out of Washington is really interesting. Troy Franklin's a little bit like light in the tuchus, but if he can put on a little bit of extra weight to go with that big 6'1", 6'2" frame, he could be a good guy there too. And there are other receivers that end up landing down there too, Lad McConkey, Roman Wilson, and others. So lots of opportunity here. Yeah,
Malachi is a guy. I don't know if that's the fit because they need a possession style receiver, but I think that's one. And of course, defensive interior is really what I'm looking at. And there's a lot of good players. Of course, it was really shocking that you didn't see the defense go until like 15. Yeah, it's just tough. And it's not that the defense is bad. It's just there was a run on quarterbacks, and they have a lot of really strong defensive tackles. I think that's an area where interior that they could look at doing it. You got Rook out of Rook, or I can't ever say his name right. That's a guy that you could look at. I like T'Vondre Sweat. He could be a day 3 guy, but I think that's a little bit of an underrated need. And there's obviously a lot of guys that they could look at to fill that. But you're just being at 45. There's a player you got to come away with that's probably going to be, we talked about this earlier on our show, is somebody that's going to come in practically day 1 and be able to, I don't know to say start, but going to be a significant contributor to the team.
Yeah, at least have some impact. Be ready to have some impact your rookie season. I think that's what you got to be ready to do. I'll throw another kind of curveball out there. I think the day 2 defensive back has been a big time staple for the New Orleans Saints draft. You look at Marcus Williams, you look at Von Bell, Alontae Taylor, you look at the trade up for Paulson Adebo, right? He was a round 3 guy. And so I don't rule out the idea of a day 2 defensive back. Tyler Nubin, the safety out of Minnesota,
makes sense.
Could make so much sense for this team. You could potentially see them go corner if the right guy is there as well. And I think like the corner thing does not mean that a Marshawn Lattimore trade would be imminent, but you have to be ready for what does 2025 look like for this team. What things might work out with Marshawn here in 2024, but going into 2025 may not. Paulson Adebo is going into a contract year. Will he re-sign? There's a lot of question marks still for the Saints when it comes to corners where you want to prepare for your future. So I could absolutely see a day 2 DB be something that we see the New Orleans Saints fall back on yet again as well. But I'd love to see them go for one of the pass catchers or interior defensive guys.
Yeah, and one little thing I heard from Joe Woods today, he was doing WWL radio, and he said about the quarterback group that they feel really good and pretty sad about that. I thought that was really interesting. Not that it meant anything for Marshawn, but him just saying that. I mean, you got Paulson, Alontae, and then obviously some of the other guys that have been here, some undrafted guys that they picked up. I mean, that was, I don't know, maybe telling, maybe we're reading too much into it. But then again, Joe Woods is a guy that doesn't really just throw a lot of nonsense out for anything like that. But take that for what it's worth. But really exciting day 2. We'll be back here tomorrow at the facility. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Second and Saints. I'm not going to take your thunder.
No, it just hit me that interior offensive line could be a spot that they go to. Cooper Beebe at 45.
Jackson Johnson, yes.
On the board.
Wouldn't be surprising because I think, you look at James Hurst. And again, if you didn't know, they knew this was coming. They said this wasn't a surprise. I thought it was really nice. Jeff Ireland said that him and his agent did this the right way. So it's not like it caught him off guard and that he just said he's up and going to retire. It's something he thought about last offseason and such. But the need for a left guard. We talked about Dalton Reisner as a guy in free agency. They could bring back Andres Pete for something if they wanted to. I think it'll be somewhat telling to see if they do prioritize that on day 2. And I don't think that would be as bad of a look to rebuild the trenches as well. But, the needs are still there. Receiver, interior offensive line, defensive tackle, and a defensive back. You can never have too many defensive backs. And so there are some good ones you could get in day 3 for sure. But I think that's kind of the way the Saints are going to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense there. And seeing exactly like all of those needs or all those places where it makes sense to address and seeing the talent that's still left on this board, it's going to shape up to be a pretty solid selection by the time they get on the board with that 13th selection in day 2.
Absolutely. Sure. So tomorrow evening we'll be here. It's going to be 6 o'clock now.
Yeah, start
6 o'clock, 6 o'clock Central Time. Let me preface some of those that are there. It's past midnight here, and so obviously work never stops. And so, look, guys, we appreciate your support as always. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. We are going to be here and bring you as much material as we possibly can. If you haven't seen the DA interview, it's up on the site. If you haven't seen the interview with Fuaga, that's also up. And so plenty of stuff coming at you, but that'll do it for us tonight. On behalf of Ross Jackson and John Hendricks, signing out.